Hi. All right. So, welcome. Hope you guys have had a good day. There's been a lot of knowledge. Hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully you had some fun. Got to laugh at some of Steve Edelman's jokes and all that stuff, so that's always fun. And the day's wrapping up, so this is kind of one of the last sessions, and then make sure to stick around. Right at 4:30 in this room will be the very closing session, and the raffle and all that will take place right after that. So after this session, don't go anywhere. Make sure you've turned in your raffle tickets too. Okay, well, let's talk. So just to start off with, if you guys have questions along the way, it's a pretty small group, but I want to make sure we get a chance to go through everything. So do me a favor, keep track of your questions, and we'll definitely have time at the end to open up for discussion. And so hold those till the end, but we'll get to some question time. And the purpose of this talk is, well, it's self-explanatory to some degree, but it's to talk about continuous glucose monitoring in type 2 diabetes. And it's a little bit of a different sort of approach than the way that we've thought about CGM or continuous glucose monitoring in type 1 diabetes, where for some time now, at least this last few years and the last decade, we've been pushing for it really as a standard of care so that we think that a lot of the people with type 1 diabetes need to have these devices. For type 2 diabetes, it's not quite as clear. And so as the technology has improved and we've had more and more options, then I think it's become a tool also for type 2 diabetes. And we'll kind of talk about why. And talk about some of the different devices, talk about what a CGM even is, and then kind of take a look at where this is all headed. And that way you can think about if this is something that might be useful for you. So this is just sort of one of those historical slides, kind of the classic. Over here on the far left, a long time ago, the only way people had to really check what their blood sugars were, well, it wasn't even blood sugar, was to check the glucose in the urine. And so you basically had to have a whole science experiment just to figure out where how much urine you're peeing out, and then you would use that to figure out how much insulin to dose and all this. So really tough to do. And then, starting in the 80s, we saw this, the home glucose monitors become available, and those have improved certainly over time. They've become easier to use, faster, you use less blood, but you still got to prick your finger to really take advantage of these. And you got to be testing enough throughout the day to make sense, and that's different for every person. So it really depends on if you're someone who's just on metformin and your A1C is great, then do you need to be poking your finger all the time to see what your blood sugar is? Maybe not. But if you're given multiple daily injections, like Dr. Santos said earlier, you really should be checking your blood sugar at least 3-4 times a day to kind of know what's going on. So there's a whole spectrum depending on, where your blood sugar control is, how much you want to know, and if you're going to use that information. But certainly, no one likes pricking their fingers, and it's literally a pain. And some people get used to it, but there may be better ways to do it. And those better ways right now are these continuous glucose monitors. So they've been around now for a couple decades, but haven't really hit the mainstream until really the last few years in terms of their availability and sort of the options out there for use, especially in type 2 diabetes. So what does the CGM kind of do? Well, if you think of it this way, there's 1,440 minutes in a day, and each one of those minutes your blood sugar is fluctuating, right? Even if it's pretty flat, it's going up and down. So if you check throughout the day, let's say 6 times, which is quite a bit to be poking your finger 6 times a day, then you have captured basically 0.4% of the day's blood sugars. And you don't really have any idea what's going on all the rest of the time, the other 99.6% of the time. So the idea behind the continuous glucose monitor is to catch all that other time. So what is a CGM? And there's some sort of general pieces that come together to make a CGM system. So this is sort of a generalization, but it helps to understand how these work. First of all, there's a glucose sensor, okay? And this glucose sensor, this is an example at like 1,000 times bigger than the actual. That would say, this is the Dexcom device, just as an example. This sits up on top of the skin, and this little tiny, basically wire, it's not even a needle, it's a little wire like a filament, so if you poke it, it's like kind of like a soft bendy wire, will sit under the skin. And that sensor is sitting there and checking the glucose level under the skin continuously, basically every minute to, in some cases up to every 15 minutes, depending on how the device is set up. So it's constantly checking the glucose level under the skin right there, and that glucose level under the skin is basically used as a surrogate for what the actual blood glucose is, okay? And in most cases, those are very close. There are some exceptions to that, but it's generally very accurate. And then the next piece to a CGM system is a wireless transmitter. And so you have this sensor that's actually checking the information. And then in this case, this is a transmitter that's attached to it so that you can actually do something with that information. So this wireless transmitter then sends the data to some type of receiver. And the receiver can be like a standalone device that you carry. And some people like to have their own separate device. And this is, again, just an example. This is the Dexcom one here on the screen that shows your blood sugars. And increasingly, people are just using their smartphones. So every major CGM now has a smartphone app so that you can just get this information right on your phone. So if you have a smartphone, then you can get the same information without having to carry an extra device. And let's see. So this just, and then briefly, just when you're looking at this, this is kind of the information that will pop up right off the bat. So your sort of minute-to-minute information is what is your blood sugar, right? It's continuously checking. And you want to know, okay, what's my blood sugar right now? So you look down at either the standalone device or your phone, and it'll say, right, blood sugar is 205 right now. And then we'll talk about some of these other features like trend arrows. So you'll see there's a little kind of arrow pointing up here. This little device has it, it's a little smaller, it's pointing up. So all these different things that'll be more information that you can use, and we'll get to that stuff. So the truth of the matter is that a CGM provides you with way more information than you can get from your A1C or from doing finger pricks, okay, from using your glucose meter. And one way to look at that is to kind of compare it to A1C levels. So an A1C, someone tell me, what does an A1C tell us? What do we use that for? 3-month average, great. So it's the average, basically tells us an idea of how your blood sugar has been running for 3 months. So last 2 to 3 months, exactly. So now what a continuous glucose monitor does, of course, it gives you continuous glucose data, but it really, if you're gonna get the most out of it, you're gonna use that information when you're making decisions throughout the day, right? So we'll look at it, see what you're gonna eat, when you're gonna exercise. If you're using insulin or other medications that you adjust the dose on, you might use that to decide how much of that medication to use. And also you may use it to say, hey, like, as, you know, Trish Santos was talking about earlier, maybe your favorite meal, you may realize actually makes your blood sugar super high. So you may decide, well, you know, I like that meal, but I'll eat half of as much of it next time. You get trend arrows, which I'll talk more about. Some of them have alerts and alarms for high and low blood sugars. And these are features that some people really should have and that they need for safety issues, but other folks, it wouldn't be as important. You can share this data with your friends or family, and you can look at basically glycemic reports. So all this data that's being collected by this little device, you can kind of download in a report form, and I'll show you an example of that, and kind of look at, okay, where have I actually been for the last 7 days or 14 days or month? And it'll give you an idea of, you know, hey, look, I'm high every day after lunch, or I'm going low at nighttime. So that's what the reports are really useful for you to look back and review and potentially make some changes, either to your medications or your diet or whatever it may be. All right, so talking about the A1C, we said it's a 3-month average of your blood sugars. So this is just sort of a cartoon example, but what this shows are 3 different patients, all of whom have an A1C of 7, okay? And this is sort of what their CGM would look like if they wore it. So this, again, these CGM tracings oftentimes are in a 24-hour day. So they start at midnight, they go till noon, and then they go back to the next midnight. So that's 24 hours. So think of this as 3 different people. Now, if they all have the same A1C, assuming that the A1C is accurate, then they all have the same average blood sugar, right? But there's so much more to this picture that we would never see by the A1C. So if you could choose between being patient 1, patient 2, and patient 3, and having an A1C of 7, which of those numbers would you choose? Yeah, exactly, 3, right? That person number 3's blood sugars look a lot nicer to me than the other 2. So patient number 1, average may be looking really good, but they're having all these high blood sugars and they're getting super low. Patient number 2 still kind of having these swings, but not as bad. But you know, person number 3's really kind of got it nailed in, and that's something that you know you can really see only if you use a continuous glucose monitor. This is the same 3 people, and this breaks down basically looking at their time in range. And without spending too much time on that, this is a term, time in range is a term that really came from CGM. And so it's something that people are talking about more and more. And it gets a little bit away from your average blood sugar, because as we can see, the average blood sugar misses a lot of information. And so time in range, if you're in range, that means your blood sugar is between 70 and 180, okay? If you're above 180, that puts you in the above range, and if you're below 70 and having lows, then that puts you below range. So these are those same 3 people, and we all said, hey, look, number 3, they're within range all the time. That's who I'd want to be, if I could, or at least that's who I'd strive to be. And then these other people with the same A1C are having a harder time. They're having more highs and more lows. So that's something that we can see with a continuous glucose monitor that we would miss with an A1C. All right, trend arrows. So trend arrows are really one of the important features of CGM. And the trend arrow tells you, so the continuous glucose monitor is going to tell you what your blood sugar is right at this moment, and the trend arrow is going to tell you which direction it's going, okay? So these are 2 different sort of CGM systems, but they both have trend arrows. And you can see both of them, actually, the trend arrow is pointed sort of up to the right, okay? And if you look at it, it'll tell you basically which direction your blood sugar is going and how fast. So these are all different options for the trend arrows. So if the trend arrow is flat like this, then your blood sugar is running flat. If it's up at an angle or down at an angle, then your blood sugar is either increasing or decreasing, but at a pretty slow rate. Then if the arrows are straight up, or even a double up arrow, then you're really your blood sugars are going up fast, and the same for the down arrows. And this can be important for people who have low blood sugars or people that take insulin, because if you have down arrows, then your blood sugar is falling quickly, okay? So using these trend arrows, even if you don't have insulin, but if you have a CGM, and looking where your blood sugar is going, maybe after a meal or after you exercise, okay, I know where my blood sugar is, but is it going up or down? So here's another example of where trend arrows can be really important. So this is one patient, and the black line here shows after breakfast. If you had a continuous glucose monitor on them, you would see what their blood sugars did. So their blood sugars went up, and then they fell after breakfast, okay? If they didn't have a CGM and you were just using a glucose meter, and so you're doing finger sticks at those time points, so they may check shortly after breakfast and say, hey, my blood sugar is 150. And then they may check a couple hours later and say, hey, my blood sugar is 150 again. Well, that's interesting. So 2 150s, but what's going on? Are they going up? Are they going down, right? So you would have no idea that this number is 150, but they're about to go really high, and this number is 150, but they're about to go low, right? So if you had just a glucose meter, you get the same number with no trend arrows. All right, so here's your glucose meter. You check it, it's a 220. That might be a little higher than you like. But here's a 220 with 2 up arrows. So this person's 220, a little high, and then definitely going to get higher. Here's a 220 with 2 down arrows. This person's actually, the blood sugar's fallen down pretty quick. So the question is, would you treat these numbers the same? So I would say probably shouldn't. And what you may want to decide, hey, if I'm 220, maybe I want to do something to help prevent that from going higher. So if I'm somebody who, when I go for a walk, my blood sugar goes down, which is not always the case, then maybe I'll go for a walk and kind of nip this thing in the bud because my blood sugars are going to go higher. If you use short-acting insulin, maybe this would be a chance where maybe you'd want to take a little bit of insulin to help bring it down. If you're 220 and falling really fast, if you're on a medication that can cause low blood sugars, like the sulfonylureas, glipizide or glyburide, or if you use insulin and your blood sugar is falling really quick, you're really going to want to watch this. Because even though you're 220, if you have 2 down arrows, an hour from now you might be low. So this is a chance for you to kind of watch it, and if you need to eat something and keep your blood sugar from dipping down too fast. Okay. Alerts and alarms. So these come with a lot of the CGMs. So I kind of put here which of the major, these are basically 4 major systems right now: Dexcom, Medtronic, Eversense, and the Freestyle Libre, and I'll talk about each of those specifically. Those top 3 all have alerts and alarms. Right now, the Freestyle Libre doesn't. So it's one sort of factor that differentiates between those? I think that the alarms, so probably the most important reason for the alarms is if you want to know when you have high and low blood sugars. So in this case, this alarm is going off because this person has a blood sugar that's above 200, so they probably set their high alert at 200. They want to know. I want to know when my blood sugar is 200 because I'm going to do something about it. This person has a low alarm going off. So with this setup, anytime that your blood sugar goes under 54, it has a mandatory alert. This is the Dexcom. So it's going to alert you that you're low. So if you're someone who has lows or has had bad lows, this is really a safety feature that's really important. So people that use multiple daily injections of insulin, for example, or have had low blood sugars, this is something to think about if you want this alert to let you know and kind of help protect you. So you can set the alerts to whatever number you want. So maybe you want to know when your blood sugar hits 80 so it doesn't go too low, then you can use it for that. Okay, here's the same person, right? They check their blood sugars after breakfast, and let's say they did not have the CGM, so we're just going off of their finger sticks. So basically, they don't have any alarms if they're just doing finger sticks, right? So they got the 150 and the 150, and without the alerts and the alarms, they had no idea that their blood sugar actually got up to, 230. They just missed that whole peak. And then they ended up dropping pretty low actually after the breakfast. Their medication kind of kicked in. For whatever happened, they had a low blood sugar where they dropped down to like 60. And if they had an alert or an alarm here, then that could have told them before they had a low. So those are the reasons that we recommend that people use these alerts and alarms if they have them on their CGM. There's the ability to share with friends and family. And this is something that, again, is very personal. Some people love this and some people don't use it, which is fine. But it makes great sense if you have a kid with diabetes and you're a parent, maybe you want to know what's going on with them. But a lot of people really like to have a friend or a diabetes buddy or a spouse or someone else be able to kind of keep an eye on their blood sugars. That way, if you have a low blood sugar, they'll get an alert and they can check in with you. Or even if you feel like it's somebody that you're comfortable with just kind of watching over with you and keeping you honest, that's okay too. So those are options. And then I mentioned that you can download sort of the reports. And this is something that actually not that many people do, but I think it's underutilized. So it's a good way to look back and say, all right, what am I actually doing? What can I improve on? If you go into the doctor's office, hopefully they're looking at it, and hopefully they're kind of reviewing some of this information with you. But even if they're not, you can download it and look at it yourself. So this is an example of a report from the Libre, okay, the Freestyle Libre, which is one of the glucose monitors. And it looks like there's a lot going on, but it's actually, once you look at these a couple times, it's not too complicated. So this person downloaded 14 days worth of data. So the last 2 weeks of information are all on this page. And it shows what their average blood sugar was. So the average was 148, right? And this thing was, they're wearing this for every day for 2 weeks. So this is all the blood sugars over 2 weeks. And then it basically shows these times in range, right? So between 70 and 180, and then the time above that and the time below that. So you might pay attention, hey, there's persons having some low blood sugars. There's 8% of their time is less than 70. And there's maybe some high blood sugars to work on as well. And those are kind of the major things that we look at. And some of these other things, like the standard deviation, show how much variability of blood sugars you're having around the average. So as part of this report also, this will come up. So again, this is like a 24-hour type day. But what this chart does is this ambulatory glucose profile combines every single blood sugar that the device checked over the past 2 weeks, and it kind of combines it in one graph, okay? So basically it connects it with the time of day, and this blue line in the middle is the average blood sugar at each time point throughout the day, okay? So like this is midnight, this is overnight, early morning, noon, afternoon, evening, etc. And then the shaded areas, either above or below that line, show sort of the variability. So is there more high blood sugars? Is there more low blood sugars? Are the blood sugars close to that average during that time period? And what jumps out, just glancing right at this person right off the top, I would say, whoa, like they're having 8% lows. We know that. And I can see where they're happening. They're happening here in the middle of the night. So something that this person's doing, depends on what medicines they're on or whatever, but their blood sugar when they're going to bed is actually getting high, and then they're going low overnight. So that would require an adjustment because it's not safe to have these low blood sugars. And this is something that you can see really easily and quickly looking back at the trends like this. And if you pull this up, you can pick out your own areas that you want to improve on really quick. You say, hey, I want to get these evening highs a little bit lower, or I'm spiking up after breakfast every day. What's going on with that? So it's a good way to kind of come up with a plan. So what are the benefits ultimately of using a CGM? So if you wear it with regularity, it really empowers you to make healthy decisions. So a lot of times I've had people who would sometimes do finger stick glucoses, but they decided to get a CGM like the Freestyle Libre where they can flash it and look at their blood sugar. And all of a sudden they become really engaged and they want to know, hey man, what does this meal do to my blood sugars? What does walking do to my blood sugars? And it really helps them to decide sort of what kind of healthy behaviors they want to take part in. So it empowers you to do that. You don't have to do it, but it gives you the information that you would need. It can improve your A1C and your time in range, okay? So we know that, and that's always a benefit. And it can also potentially decrease your low blood sugars. So if you are someone that has low blood sugars, this can help with that by giving you alerts and alarms and letting you know when those lows are happening. All right, so what's currently available? So what could you, depending on your insurance coverage and these sorts of things, what devices are out there right now? So the first one, which I put first because I think for a lot of people, this is probably maybe the best first CGM to get involved in because it's pretty easy to use. And it gives you most of the major features of other CGMs, with the exception that it doesn't have alerts and alarms. So this is the Freestyle Libre device. And this nice lady's wearing the device on her arm. It's a little patch, that's a sensor, and it has a transmitter also just in it. And that transmitter basically will send the information to this receiver anytime she takes the receiver and flashes it over her arm. So it's kind of like an on-demand glucose monitor. Okay, so anytime she wants to know what her blood sugar is, she goes like this, beep, and it's right there. And in fact, it downloads this little piece will actually store up to 8 hours of glucose information right in her arm. So when she flashes it, it'll get the last 8 hours of information downloaded. So you could get every single glucose in your whole day by flashing it 3 times over your arm. So the sensor, that white piece that she put on, is really easy to put on. It just kind of sticks on the arm. And it has a 1-hour warm up and then it's up and running. It's factory calibrated. So it's ready to go basically out of the box. And it lasts for 14 days. So you basically have to swap that thing out, put a new patch on every 2 weeks. Like I said, if you want to know what your blood sugar is, you have to swipe to get it. So unlike some of the other CGMs, this device is not sending that information automatically to your smartphone or anywhere else. It's sitting on that patch on your arm until you swipe for it, and then you get it all on either the reader or your smartphone, depending on what you want to use. It does have trend arrows. You don't have to do any finger sticks. If you wanted to check your blood sugar with a finger stick, it actually has a glucose meter built in, so you can just do it with this reader. Again, this device doesn't have any alerts or alarms, but I think it's still a really good option for people if you're not needing those alerts and alarms for low blood sugars. It's easy to use. If you're someone who is using a glucose meter and you're just finding it a pain in the butt and you want to know what your blood sugars are, but you're sick of poking your fingers, this is the device I would recommend. And this is also the device that's probably the easiest to get covered by insurances. Not everybody's covering it. Sometimes you got to fight for it. But a lot of times people with type 2 diabetes, and definitely if you're doing insulin, they'll cover this if you're doing multiple daily doses. And sometimes they'll just cover it instead of giving you a bunch of test strips, because the test strips are actually really expensive. So it's worth checking to see if you're interested, if this is covered with your insurance. Just to kind of round it out, I'll talk about the other CGMs too. So this is the Medtronic Guardian device. This, it kind of is a device that is used a lot in type 1 diabetes, but certainly people with type 2 diabetes can use it. It's associated with the insulin pump, and it can also be used as a standalone CGM. The sensor is worn for 7 days. It's a little bit harder to put on, and it has a 2-hour warm-up period, but it'll talk to your smartphone or your pump. And it also has trend arrows. The thing about this CGM is it still requires doing finger sticks. So I think, to keep it calibrated, you have to poke your finger 2 to 4 times a day. So I don't think there's a lot of people with type 2 diabetes that this CGM makes sense for. And for that reason, I like some of the other options a little bit better. It does have alarms and sharing capabilities. The Dexcom device, you've heard that term a lot. This is one of the CGMs that we use all the time in clinic, and a lot of our patients use it. We recommend it to a lot of patients who need to know what's going on with their blood sugars. It has basically all the same features. This sensor is worn. You can see this person wearing it on their abdomen. This was worn for 10 days. It's pretty easy to put on. It has a 2-hour warm-up, and it sends it to either a receiver. This is the standalone receiver, or to your smartphone. It has trend arrows. It does not require any finger sticks, so it comes pre-calibrated. So you don't have to calibrate it by doing finger sticks, which is nice. And it has alerts, alarms, and sharing capability. So this is a really nice CGM. It may be more than a lot of people need. It may have more features than a lot of people need. And if you aren't doing multiple daily injections, like injecting insulin with each meal, then this might be hard to get covered also with insurance. But if you're someone who's had a lot of low blood sugars, or you're giving insulin injections, this would definitely be an option. And then lastly, the Senseonics Eversense. This is an implantable CGM, which is just really kind of a different approach. All the pieces are sort of similar, but they have this sensor that gets implanted under the skin in a sort of simple in-office procedure, where they do a little kind of nick in the arm and put it under the skin, and it stays in the arm for 90 days. In Europe, it's approved for 180 days, and they want to get it approved here for that too. It just hasn't been yet. But anyway, so it sits under your arm for basically 3 months at a time. And then on top of it, you wear this other little transmitter basically on the outside of the skin that you can take on and off anytime you want to. And that will send the information to the smartphone app. So it's just kind of another little different approach. And this would be one, again, that I think if you were doing multiple daily injections and you had a lot of low blood sugars, you might think about. But otherwise, it might be more than you need. Okay, what's coming down the line? So the next sort of level of the Freestyle Libre, or they call it the Libre II, is basically in progress right now. It's not available in the United States. It's very similar to the current Freestyle Libre. What is a little bit different about it is that it will offer these optional alarms. So you can turn on alarms if you want to for high and low blood sugars. People are using it in Europe already. It's been approved there, but not yet by the FDA. So it's just not something that we can get here. But I think it will address some of the shortcomings maybe of the current Freestyle Libre. And I like the idea of being able to have alarms in case you have a low blood sugar, and if you want, high blood sugar too, so you know what's going on. And then the next version, we saw this picture earlier, the next version of the Dexcom, which they're sort of calling right now the G7, it's being developed currently, so this is not commercially available. This is the current one, which isn't that big, but it looks pretty big right here, and this is the new one. So their whole goal is to make this, factory calibrated, so you don't have to stick your fingers, fully disposable, and a really easy application with a significant cost reduction. So they're trying to make these more affordable, more available to people, so you can slap one of these on, know what your blood sugar is at all points in time, then whenever you want to check it, and then at the end of the week or 2 weeks, whenever you're done with it, toss it and put a new one on without breaking the bank. So that's the ultimate goal of this type of device. Okay, great. So that's actually all I have in terms of slides. So I'd love to, if anyone has questions, I'd love to talk about it. Yeah?
What impact does when hypoglycemic event have on your A1C or on the meter itself?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, what impact does a low blood sugar or hypoglycemic event have on your A1C or on the meter? So, so the A1C is an average. So you can get your average blood sugar down by having a lot of really bad low blood sugars. It's not healthy, I don't recommend it, but it'll do it. So if you have low blood sugars, it'll make your A1C look better. So even if you're having a lot of high blood sugars, the low blood sugars can help average it out, but it's not a safe way to get there because the lows can be causing damage. So the low blood sugars definitely factor into the A1C. Yeah. And in terms of, for these devices, they tend to work pretty well during low blood sugars. they lose some of their accuracy at the really low range. But I think that's why it's nice to have, if you do have lows, to have a device that gives you an alert, like when your blood sugar is maybe 70 or 80. So before you get down to 40 or 50, and then it's going to be less accurate. Yeah. You can always do a finger stick. Thank you. Great. Yeah, and so if you're not sure, your blood sugar comes out low on your device and you want to double check it, it's always good to double check it if you're not trusting it. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So for the Libre, can you print out the glucose report? Yeah, certainly you can. So, but you have to basically, so if you have a Libre, you have to make an online account, and then it'll link into that account and save it, and then you can print out like the PDF of the reports, which I definitely recommend doing. In fact, if you have a Libre, and depending on your doctor's office, they may not know how to even do that, or they may do that routinely. So in our office, because we see a lot of people with diabetes, when they come in, we download that report and we have it in paper form so we can go over it together. Some people though, who maybe they don't have an endocrinologist, they have a primary care clinic and they're not equipped to do all the downloading, sometimes people will just print that off at home and bring it in. And so they can say, hey, look doc, like what's going on with this? And we can talk about the average and where those things are going. So you definitely can print it out. And I encourage people to actually look at their own download and see. Yeah, good. Yeah. 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 Very good question. The question is, do I see the use of these basically expanding and increasing amongst people who maybe aren't using insulin or not doing multiple daily injections as the costs sort of go down? And the answer is definitely. And there's been a huge, especially with the Freestyle Libre, which has kind of been groundbreaking in that way. So the Freestyle Libre, let's say you're paying just cash without any insurance coverage, costs somewhere about half as much as like, for example, the Dexcom. So it is much more affordable, and they will continue to make that hopefully more and more affordable so more people can use it. The idea, I think, ultimately would be, whether you're on insulin or not, that these are available for everybody. And you can decide if you want to have this type of device or you want to just do finger sticks or whatever. It's a patient preference. But I certainly hope so, and that's sort of, I think, where things have been moving. And as we get more companies who have some of the less expensive options, that would be great for anybody with diabetes, whether you're on insulin or not. That way you'd know what's going on. More information is good. Yeah. 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 Okay, good question. So the first question was about GlucoTrack being developed in Israel. I'm actually not familiar with that, so I won't comment on it. The second question was just about sort of the comfort of wearing the devices and which one is sort of like less painful if you're wearing it. So I've worn, out of all those sensors, I've worn two of them, the Dexcom and the Freestyle Libre. Neither of them, honestly, are particularly painful. So they both basically, the way that the application of those works is you have a little device that basically goes on the skin, on the body, and generally you press a button, and there's a little tiny needle that kind of pokes in real quick and inserts that little filament. So it's like sort of an instantaneous little poke, and then that needle gets retracted automatically, so you never see it or whatever. And then that little piece is just kind of stays under the skin, and you don't feel it once it's in there. So you may be like, oh, I kind of felt that little poke, but it's not painful. It's less painful than a single finger stick. And then once it's on, most times people don't really notice it. I mean, you can get some irritation around the site from the adhesives, and there's other issues like that people have. I think ultimately the Freestyle Libre is the lowest profile. It's flatter and a little bit smaller. It's generally worn on the back of the arm. So if you get it in a good spot, you can just put it on there and leave it there for 2 weeks. And you don't tend to rub it on stuff as much. Sometimes it gets knocked off or something, you have to replace it. But in general, when I've worn those, I don't even notice it's there. It's basically like a sticker. So sometimes I feel like, oh, it's like pulled on one of my little arm hairs or something, but it's not painful. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting question. Nanotech, is there any conversation about nanotechnology in diabetes? Not that I'm aware of. I think, I guess you could probably talk about there potentially being, a decade or more down the road, some innovations that could help with, very small devices that monitor glucose. And I think as these continue to shrink, the border between what these glucose sensors do and maybe what nanotechnology could help with might be possible. But nothing that I've heard of that people are actively working on. It's a good question. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So her family member has type 2 diabetes and a pretty high A1C. Just recently was started on a Freestyle Libre to help give some information about what's going on. But he's been reluctant to prick his fingers, but also has been reluctant to just scan the thing and look at it. That's tough. I mean, I think that goes back to more like well, you weren't here. So we had a discussion earlier, probably during the type 2 track, about people checking their blood sugars and being honest with the physicians. It's a tough thing, and I think that has to be kind of done on an individual basis. So the only reason to really have that device and scan it is if you want to know what the number is and do something about it. So I think the first thing would be to encourage him to say, hey, your blood sugar is going to be high, that's okay, but this is just a way to learn about it. You don't even have to necessarily act on it, but scan it, see where your blood sugar is, see what's going on at nighttime. Are you going down overnight? Are you staying high overnight? Is it after certain meals? Just use it as a tool. And like I said before, a lot of people actually, once they kind of start scanning, then they get the feel for it, and they really appreciate having it there. But it can be hard. If he just doesn't want to know, then he won't scan it. So I think that's tough. That would be something to kind of slowly work on. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I can see over there. Yeah, so my understanding is that Medicare for type 2 diabetes, they're a little slow on the uptake. They will cover the Freestyle Libre for people who are doing like multiple daily injections of insulin, but there's been some pushback otherwise. So not necessarily. I think if you use insulin at all, then it's worth at least trying. You can make an appeal. Say, hey, I'm on insulin. Maybe I've had a low blood sugar. Get a doctor's letter, a prior authorization or something, request for that. Hopefully they will continue. I think that it will become more and more available moving forward, but Medicare right now has been a little slow. Yeah. Yeah, for better or for worse, test strips are super expensive also. And so I think a lot of the insurance providers are starting to understand that they can provide these, like a Freestyle Libre for not that much more and really get more bang for their buck out of it. But that's always a slow process. Yeah. Yeah.
Good question. Why do the manufacturers, when they develop these products, come out with a price point that they know most people can't even afford? And know full
Yeah.
well that the insurance company will cover it or put it on the formulary
Yeah.
or Medicare or anybody else. Why do they go that route?
The question is about the price point. Why does it come out so high even though a lot of people can't afford it? I don't know. I won't even speculate. Your guess is as good as mine. They do a lot of analyses, and these are companies that are for profit ultimately, and so their goal is to make money. I think a lot of the companies do have true interest in helping people, but ultimately they're also trying to make money. So I don't have a good answer for you on that. They do a lot of analysis and try to come up with the best price point where they can get it to people, but still make money. And sure. And they hope their goal is to go out and convince insurance companies that it's worthwhile, and hope that the insurance companies will pay for it. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you have Medicare, you were on a Dexcom, and then once you were able to get off of insulin because you lost a lot of weight, they no longer gave you Dexcom, but they said the Libre is okay. So yeah, it may depend on the insurance. It's certainly something that's worth checking, and then it's it's one of those things where you kind of have to advocate sometimes and fight for it a little bit. And the more people that are advocating for it, the more likely they start to pay attention to it and make it more available. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. He got it done. Yes. So. So if you're on, that's specifically if you're on a pump or just if you're using insulin? Yeah, interesting. So for people on Medicare, in this case, on an insulin pump, so if you're using an insulin pump, then it was actually covered under Part B, and it was not under the drug. Yeah. And then they will give you a CGM basically to support the insulin use with the pump. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Good. Dexcom 6. Yeah. Yeah, great point. So she's saying that, first of all, you can always go buy these. You need a prescription, but if you don't have insurance coverage and you think this is going to be something that that will really help you and you can afford it, you can pay cash for these devices. And if you, she's saying that if you do that through, if you use, where's the coupon through? Yeah, through GoodRx, which is a great website. So you can find a manufacturer's coupon to basically bring the cost down to about $120 a month for the 2 sensors, which will get you through the whole month. You don't need the standalone reader. You can just download the app if you have a smartphone, and so that's free. So it's just basically paying cash for those sensors. So if it's something that you really think might benefit you and you have $120 a month, then it's something to think about, especially if you're buying test strips already, because you won't need those. Yeah. 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 Well, I think that's that's unfortunate because, so the question is, so her doctor says, well, there's no reason to use a CGM because you're not going to give insulin, you're not doing anything, you're not going to be able to treat it, so what are you going to do with that information? But I think more information is better. And I have, like I said, I've seen many people who have just by the very fact of having, for example, a Freestyle Libre and being able to check their blood sugars, have made major lifestyle changes, losing weight, adjusting their diet. People who have said, that was the thing that motivated me to give up regular soda and switch to diet, and now my A1C dropped by 1.5 points or whatever. So knowledge is power, and I think being able to see what your blood sugars are doing throughout the day at different points in times, how diet and exercise affect your blood sugars, and what your lifestyle changes are or aren't doing for you could be really powerful. So that would be my argument. In fact, they've done studies that if you really wanted to stick it to them, you could try to find these papers, but they've done studies in terms of using CGM purely as a motivational sort of informational tool, not in people who are using insulin or anything else. So it's not that they're using it to give treatment decisions, but just to motivate them and to inform them on what's going on, and people improve. Their A1C gets better, they tend to lose weight, they tend to be healthier. So there is actually some good data to support that. Yeah. Okay.
Are there any medications that interfere with that?
Yeah, are there any medications that interfere with the CGM? That's a good question. There used to be, it used to be a problem with acetaminophen, which is like in Tylenol and a lot of other medications. With like the old Dexcom devices would have that problem, but with these current sensors, no, not really. So the newest Dexcom doesn't have that problem. The Freestyle Libre does not either. So there's not really any major medications that interfere with them anymore. That was the biggest one, yeah. Yeah, so she said being dehydrated. So there are some things that can make the readings a little bit off. And the times when the sensors are probably least accurate are times when, you know, because they're sitting under the skin, if that area doesn't really represent what's going on in your bloodstream. And so being dehydrated is kind of an example of that, because you're so dehydrated, your blood sugars in your blood may be changing, but you don't have that much fluid in your body to sort of equilibrate across the different spaces. Also, if your blood sugars are going up really fast or falling really fast, the CGM may be accurate, but it's lagging behind, because sometimes it can be 15 or 20 minutes behind what's actually going on in the blood by the time it kind of differentiates and gets into that fluid. So those are other things that, you know, people have to kind of keep an eye on, especially if they're using insulin and their blood sugars might be changing rapidly. But I find it's less of an issue generally in type 2 diabetes. They tend to be pretty accurate. Yeah. Well, so in terms of where to wear it, the best place to wear it, each of the devices actually has sort of specific places that they've tested it. And so the Freestyle Libre, the back of the arm is just where they tested it. Yeah, and so I don't know if there's one place that's better or not better in terms of dehydration and that sort of thing. It may have the same effect everywhere. Yeah. Okay. All right, guys. That's it. Thanks very much. Thank you. Make sure you stick around for the 4:30 talk. If you haven't turned in your tickets, go do it now. Okay.